On the morning of March 17, 1985, in a brick townhouse on Q Street in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., a woman named James Brennan found a cassette tape hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick on her husband's bookshelf. The label, written in his careful handwriting, read only, "If you're listening to this, I'm already dead, or worse." She pressed play with trembling fingers. What she heard in the next 43 minutes would destroy everything she thought. She knew about the man she had loved for 11 years. The tape would not surface again until November 1991, when a CIA archivist discovered it sealed inside a file marked "Terminated, No Action." By then, Catherine was gone too. And the man on the recording, James Brennan, cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1979 to 1984, had simply ceased to exist in every official record. This is the story that tape told, and the one it couldn't. The Cold War was never fought with armies meeting on open fields. It was fought in silence, in locked rooms, encrypted cables, dead drops under park benches, and marriages that were really interrogations. By 1985, the conflict between East and West had calcified into a permanent state of contained terror. Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Yuri Andropov, dying slowly in the Kremlin, saw American missiles in every European forest. Neither side trusted the other. Neither side could afford to. But beneath the rhetoric of ideology and the mathematics of mutually assured destruction, there existed another war entirely, one fought by individuals who had chosen, or been chosen, to live double lives. These were the ghosts of the Cold War, men and women who passed secrets in bathroom stalls at international conferences, who photographed documents with cameras hidden in wristwatches, who learned to lie so completely that they forgot what the truth had ever felt like. James Brennan was one of those ghosts. Except he made one unforgivable mistake. He fell in love with someone who wasn't supposed to know. Georgetown, 1974. James and Catherine met at a faculty mixer at Georgetown University, where she taught American literature, and he was finishing a doctorate in Soviet studies. She found him charming in an old-fashioned way, soft-spoken, curious, a little sad around the eyes. He liked Tchaikovsky and bourbon, could quote Dostoevsky in Russian, and had a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' home in Connecticut. Her father, a retired State Department analyst, approved. "Good head on his shoulders," he said. "He'll go far." He was right. Just not in the way he imagined. In 1976, James was recruited by the CIA. Not for operations, at least not officially. He would be what they called a clean face, an analyst assigned to embassy posts abroad with diplomatic cover. His job was to observe, report, cultivate relationships with Soviet academics and bureaucrats, and provide cultural intelligence. It was slow work, unglamorous, essential. Catherine knew about it. She had to. Spouses of CIA officers were briefed, vetted, sometimes even trained in basic counter-surveillance. She understood the risks and accepted them. After all, everyone served somehow. This was simply their way. In 1979, James was posted to Moscow as a cultural attaché. Catherine went with him. The assignment was for 3 years, potentially 5. They moved into a gray apartment building reserved for Western diplomats on Kutuzovsky Prospect, a wide avenue lined with Soviet flags and stiff trees. The apartment was bugged. Everyone knew that. You learned not to say anything important between walls. You learned to write notes on paper and burn them in the sink. You learned to have real conversations only during walks, with the radio on, or never. Moscow in 1979 was a city of whispers and stone. The metro gleamed like an underground palace, but above ground everything looked tired. The people, the buildings, the sky. Winter came early and stayed late. You could see your breath until May. The grocery stores had lines that stretched around blocks for butter and sausage. The bookstores sold Lenin and little else. And everywhere, always, there was the sense of being watched. Not paranoia. Certainty. Catherine tried to adapt. She took Russian lessons, volunteered at the embassy library, attended dreary cocktail parties where diplomats spoke in code and Soviet officials smiled without warmth. She missed home, missed autumn in Virginia, missed teaching, missed the ordinary freedom of walking into a bookstore and buying whatever she wanted. But she told herself it was temporary. They would serve their time and go back. James would move up in the agency, maybe teach someday. They would have children. Life would resume. James told himself the same lies. But 3 months into the posting, something changed. A man approached James at a performance of Eugene Onegin at the Bolshoi Theater. Middle-aged, neat gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses. He sat down beside James during intermission and spoke in flawless English with a faint Leningrad accent. "You enjoyed the first act?" "Very much." Tchaikovsky understood longing better than anyone. The ache of wanting something you can't have. The thing that drives a man to ruin. He paused. "My name's Victor. I work for the Ministry of Culture. I think we should talk sometime. Privately." James knew what this was. A recruitment pitch. Soviet intelligence, the KGB, trying to flip an American. It happened often enough. The protocol was clear. Report it immediately. Let the agency handle it. But Victor added one more thing before he left. "Your file says you believe in something other than power." "I hope that's true. Because there are people in my government who believe the same. And if we don't find each other soon, we'll all burn together." James reported the contact. The CIA station chief in Moscow, a blunt Texan named Frank Hewitt, laughed it off. "They try this shit constantly. Ignore him. If he persists, we'll make noise." But Victor did persist. A note slipped into James's coat pocket at a book fair. A phone call to the embassy, cryptic and brief. And finally, a meeting, arranged through a trusted intermediary, a Polish academic who played both sides. The meeting took place in a shabby cafe near Patriarch's Ponds on a Sunday afternoon in December. Snow fell softly outside. Victor sat alone at a corner table, drinking black tea. He didn't waste time. "I'm not KGB. I work with them, but I'm not one of them. I'm a historian by training. I joined the party because I believed in the revolution once. Now I believe in survival. Mine. My family's, maybe my country's, if there's anything left to save. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have access to things your government needs to know. And because I'm tired of watching fools drive us toward annihilation. Andropov is dying. Chernyenko is weak. The hardliners in the Politburo think they can win a nuclear exchange if they strike first. They're wrong. But they'll try anyway unless someone stops them." James felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "What do you want from me?" "I want to pass information, strategic assessments, internal debates, weapons programs your analysts don't even know exist. In exchange, I want safety. Not now. Later. When this all falls apart, and it will, I want a way out. For me and my daughter. I can't make that promise. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to be the bridge. You report to people who can." James should have walked away. Every instinct, every hour of training told him this was either a trap or a fantasy. But something in Victor's voice, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation, felt real. And James had read enough history to know that empires collapse not when their enemies are strong, but when their own people stop believing. "I'll ask," James said. "No promises." Victor nodded. "That's all I need." For now, they met 4 more times over the next 8 months. Each time, Victor brought documents, photocopies of internal memos, transcripts of Politburo meetings, technical data on SS-20 missile deployments. James photographed them with a Minix camera the size of a cigarette lighter and passed them to the station. Hewitt was skeptical at first, then astonished. The intelligence was gold. Victor became an asset. Codename, Marble. And James became his handler. Officially, unofficially, he became something else. Because as the months passed, James realized that Victor wasn't just feeding him intelligence. He was teaching him to see the world from the other side, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The Soviet Union wasn't an evil empire. It was a dying one, run by old men terrified of losing control, propped up by violence and lies that even its own people had stopped believing. In the United States? Victor would say, smiling sadly. Your country is young. You still think you're the heroes. Wait 50 years. You'll understand. James didn't believe him. Not entirely. But the doubt had been planted. And doubt, in the world of intelligence, is the first crack in the foundation. Catherine noticed the change in her husband. He was distant, distracted. He came home late, smelling of cigarettes he didn't smoke. He stopped talking about his day, even in the careful, coded way they'd developed. When she asked if something was wrong, he smiled and said, "Just work." The usual. But his eyes said otherwise. She didn't push. In Moscow, you learn not to ask questions, but the distance grew. They still shared a bed, still attended embassy functions together, still played the role of the American couple abroad. But the intimacy had gone quiet. And Catherine, alone in that bugged apartment, began to feel like she was living with a stranger. By 1982, James had been handling Victor for 2 years. The intelligence kept coming. Better, deeper, more dangerous. Reports on Soviet strategic doctrine. Evidence of biological weapons research in Sverdlovsk. Plans for a first strike scenario if NATO deployed Pershing II missiles in West Germany. Hewitt sent urgent cables to Langley. The analysts were ecstatic. Marble was producing at a level most operations never reached. James was doing good work, essential work. But then Victor made a request. "I need you to give me something," he said during a meeting in the back room of a state bookstore. "Not for me. For them, the KGB knows I have access. They're starting to ask questions. I need to feed them something small, something true but not catastrophic. To keep them satisfied, you want me to give you American intelligence? I want you to help me stay alive long enough to keep helping you." James froze. This was the line. The one you never cross. Handing over classified information, even minor details, wasn't intelligence work. It was treason. He knew that. But he also knew that if Victor was caught, the flow of intelligence would stop. And worse, Victor would disappear. Along with his daughter, a 12-year-old girl who liked ballet and spoke 3 languages, James made the call that would destroy him. He said yes. It started small. The name of a minor CIA officer in Prague. The location of a safe house in East Berlin that had already been compromised. Information that was true, but useless. Enough to keep Victor credible. Enough to keep him alive, but the KGB wanted more. They always do. And James, trapped now, gave it to them. Slowly, carefully, always justifying it as operational necessity. Always telling himself he was protecting an asset. Always lying to Hewitt, to Langley, to Catherine, always lying to himself. By 1984, James Brennan had become exactly what Victor had once been. A man caught between 2 worlds, loyal to neither, serving both. The CIA thought he was running an agent. The KGB thought they were running him. And the truth was simpler and more terrible. He had stopped believing in either side. He had seen too much, lied too often, compromised too deeply. He didn't serve America or the Soviet Union. He served survival. His own, Victor's. And the fragile, unspoken hope that maybe, somehow, the information he was passing would help prevent the war that both sides kept threatening. But then Catherine found the tape. March 17th, 1985. They were back in Washington by then. James's posting had ended. He'd been reassigned to a desk job at Langley, analyzing Soviet economic data. He seemed relieved to be home. They'd bought the townhouse in Georgetown. Catherine had returned to teaching. Life was supposed to go back to normal. But James had grown quieter. He drank more. He woke up at night and stood by the window staring at nothing. And one morning, Catherine noticed that he'd taken the old copy of Moby Dick from the shelf, the one that had belonged to his father, and put it back in a different spot, upside down. Curious, she pulled it out. It felt wrong. Too light. She opened it and found the hollow space, and the tape. She listened to it that afternoon while James was at work. 43 minutes of his voice, calm and deliberate, explaining everything. The recruitment of Victor, the exchange of information. The moment he crossed the line, the years of deception, the guilt, the fear, and finally, the confession. I don't know what I am anymore, Catherine. I thought I was serving my country. Then I thought I was saving lives. Now I think I was just trying to survive something that can't be survived. The knowledge that we're all trapped inside a lie so big that even the people running it don't believe it anymore. I gave them secrets, not to hurt America, but to keep one good man alive. And maybe that makes me a traitor. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore except this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I became this. And I'm sorry that if you're hearing this, it means they've found out. And I'm gone. The tape ended. Catherine sat in the silence of their living room, the March sunlight coming through the window, and felt the floor drop out from under her life. She didn't know what to do. Every option was impossible. If she reported him, he would be arrested, tried, likely executed. If she didn't, she became complicit. And if she confronted him, what could he possibly say that would make any of it right? So she did the only thing she could. She hid the tape. Put the book back on the shelf exactly as she'd found it. And when James came home that evening, she kissed him and asked about his day. And he smiled and said, "The usual." They lived like that for 2 weeks. Catherine moving through the house like a ghost, waiting for something to break. James, oblivious, trying to rebuild a life that no longer existed. And then, on April 2nd, 1985, 2 men in dark suits knocked on their door. They were FBI, Counterintelligence Division. They asked James to come with them. Just a few questions, they said. Routine. Catherine watched from the doorway as they led him to an unmarked sedan. He looked back once, his face pale, and mouthed the words, "I love you." She never saw him again. What happened next exists only in fragments, bits of testimony, redacted files, whispers in the intelligence community. James was taken to a secure facility in Northern Virginia. He was interrogated for 72 hours. He confessed to everything. The meetings with Victor, the exchange of information, the years of deception. He claimed it was operational necessity, that he'd been trying to protect a valuable asset. The interrogators didn't care. They had evidence, surveillance photos, intercepted communications, a paper trail that Victor, in his final act of survival, had left behind. Victor had been arrested in Moscow 3 weeks earlier. The KGB had finally realized he was marble. They tortured him, not for information, but for punishment. He gave them James, not because he wanted to, because pain makes everyone a traitor in the end. Victor was executed by a firing squad on April 15, 1985. His daughter was sent to a state orphanage in Siberia. She would survive the Soviet Union, barely, and emigrate to Israel in 1993. She never spoke about her father. James was never formally charged. There was no trial. Officially, he resigned from the CIA for health reasons and moved abroad. In reality, he was placed in a legal twilight. Not a prisoner, but not free. The agency couldn't afford a public trial. Too many secrets would come out. Too many questions about how a cultural attach had been allowed to operate unsupervised for so long. So they buried him, erased his service record, revoked his pension, and made it clear that if he ever spoke about what had happened, he would disappear. Catherine tried to find him. She hired lawyers, contacted journalists, wrote letters to congressmen. Everyone told her the same thing. There was no record of a James Brennan ever working for the CIA. He didn't exist. Eventually, she stopped trying. The tape stayed hidden in the book, and Catherine slowly learned to live with ghosts. She died in 1989 of cancer, alone in the same Georgetown townhouse. The book was donated to a library sale. Someone bought it for $1. And the tape stayed hidden inside until 1991, when a CIA archivist doing a routine inventory found it in a box marked "Deceased Nitrogen Monoxide Follow-up Required." He listened to it once. Then he sealed it back in the file and wrote on the folder, "Terminated, no action." Because by then, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Berlin Wall had fallen. and the secrets that men like James Brennan had died protecting no longer mattered. History had moved on, but the tape remained. A ghost of a ghost. The voice of a man who had tried to choose between loyalty and love, between duty and conscience, and discovered too late that some choices destroy you no matter what you pick. The truth is, James Brennan didn't disappear in 1985. Not completely. He existed in the margins, in the spaces between official history and forgotten lives. What the FBI did with him after the interrogation was neither mercy nor justice. It was erasure with a pulse. They gave him a new name, Robert Miller. A manufactured identity with a manufactured past, a veteran of the Vietnam War, discharged with honors, now working as a technical translator for a private consulting firm in Brussels. The papers were perfect. The legend was airtight. And the message was clear. You will live, but not as yourself. You will breathe, but you will never speak. You will exist, but only as a warning to others. James, now Robert, was flown to Belgium in early May 1985. He was given a small apartment in Exile, a quiet neighborhood of Art Nouveau buildings and African grocery stores. He was given a stipend, enough to survive, but not enough to travel. And he was given a handler, a Belgian intelligence officer named Luc Devos, who checked in every 2 weeks to make sure Robert hadn't done anything stupid, like trying to contact his wife, like trying to tell the truth. For the first year, James barely functioned. He sat in his apartment and stared at the walls. He drank cheap wine and walked the streets at night, past the glowing windows of families eating dinner, past the bars full of laughter, past the train station where he could have bought a ticket to anywhere but knew he never would. He thought about Catherine constantly. He imagined her receiving some fabricated story, that he'd defected, that he'd died, that he'd simply left her. He imagined her hating him. He preferred that to imagining her still loving him. He didn't know that she was looking for him, that she'd hired lawyers and written letters and refused to believe he was gone. He didn't know that she played the tape over and over. Listening to his voice confess to crime she still didn't fully understand. He didn't know that she'd stopped sleeping, that she'd lost weight, that her colleagues at the university whispered about her in the faculty lounge. Poor Catherine, her husband left her, or maybe he was a spy, no one really knows. He didn't know because they made sure he wouldn't. No letters reached him, no phone calls. The only news he received came from Luke, in carefully edited fragments. Your wife is alive. Your wife is well. Your wife has been told you're not coming back. That was all. No details, no context. Just enough information to keep him from doing something desperate. Brussels in the mid-1980s was a city of bureaucrats and exiles, a place where people came to disappear into the machinery of the European project. James worked his translator job mechanically, converting technical manuals from Russian to English, German to French. His supervisor, a humorless Flemish woman named Marta, never asked about his past. No one did. In Brussels, anonymity was currency. Everyone was running from something. But even in exile, even under a false name, James couldn't escape the architecture of the world he'd helped build. The Cold War was still being fought, still grinding forward with its endless summits and proxy wars and missile counts. Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva in November 1985. They shook hands for the cameras and talked about trust. James watched it on television in his apartment and laughed bitterly. Trust. The word meant nothing. It never had. In 1986, something shifted. Gorbachev began speaking openly about glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. The Soviet system, he admitted, was broken. It needed reform. The hardliners in Moscow were furious, but they were old and dying. The younger generation wanted change. The Berlin Wall, once the most permanent symbol of the divided world, started to feel less like a fortress and more like a relic. James followed the news obsessively. He read every article, watched every broadcast. He began to wonder if Victor had been right all along. The empire was collapsing, not from external pressure, but from internal rot. All those years of secrets and lies, all those lives destroyed in the name of ideology, and in the end it was collapsing because people simply stopped believing. He thought about Victor often. The quiet historian who'd risked everything to pass information to an enemy he'd been taught to hate, simply because he believed the alternative was annihilation. Victor, who'd been caught and killed because James had failed to protect him. Victor, whose daughter was somewhere in Siberia, alone and forgotten. The guilt never left. It was a low hum in the background of every day, a weight that made simple tasks feel impossible. Some mornings, James stood in his kitchen and stared at the bottle of sleeping pills in the cabinet and thought about how easy it would be. One handful. A glass of water. Silence. But he didn't. Not because he wanted to live, but because he didn't deserve the relief. In 1987, Luke Devos stopped coming. No explanation. James waited through 2 missed check-ins, then 3. He called the emergency number he'd been given and got a disconnected tone. He considered going to the U.S. Embassy, but knew that would be suicide. So he simply continued. Working. Walking. Waiting. He learned later, much later, that Luke had died of a heart attack while on vacation in the Ardennes. No replacement was assigned. James Brennan, or Robert Miller, or whatever name he was supposed to answer to, had been forgotten. He was a file in a drawer somewhere, marked inactive. No longer a threat. No longer worth watching. The freedom was worse than the surveillance. Catherine never stopped looking, but she learned to hide it. She went back to teaching full-time. She published a well-regarded book on Melville and the American Gothic. She attended faculty dinners and smiled at the appropriate moments and let people believe she'd moved on. But at night, in the Georgetown townhouse, she sat with the tape and the hollowed-out book and tried to make sense of the man she'd married. She listened to the confession so many times she could recite it from memory. She heard the exhaustion in his voice, the resignation. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even asking to be understood. He was simply leaving a record. Proof that he'd existed, proof that he'd tried. In 1988, she made a decision. She contacted a journalist, a former student of hers who now worked for the Washington Post. She told him there was a story, a real story, about the CIA and a man who'd been disappeared. She offered him the tape. He listened to it in her living room on a cold November afternoon. When it finished, he looked at her with something between pity and fear. "Catherine, if I publish this, they'll destroy you. They'll claim you're mentally unstable. They'll say your husband defected or died or never existed. And they'll make sure you can never prove otherwise. Is that really what you want?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the book on the table, the tape inside it, the last remnant of a life that had been taken from her. "I just want people to know he was real," she said finally, "that we were real." The journalist shook his head. "I'm sorry, I can't help you." He left. The tape stayed. And Catherine understood in that moment that some stories are too dangerous to tell. Not because they reveal secrets, but because they reveal the machinery behind the secrets, the casual cruelty, the bureaucratic violence, the way institutions consume people and call it necessity. She never tried again. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. James watched it on television from his apartment in Brussels. Crowds of people climbing the concrete, swinging hammers and pickaxes, tearing down the symbol of everything the Cold War had been. East Germans streaming into West Berlin, crying and laughing and embracing strangers. David Hasselhoff singing on a platform above the rubble. James sat in his chair and wept. Not from joy, from exhaustion. From the knowledge that all of it, the lies, the fear, the lives destroyed, had been for nothing. The system had collapsed not because of intelligence or diplomacy or military strength, but because people had simply decided they were done. The secret police couldn't arrest everyone. The party couldn't lie fast enough. The wall couldn't hold. He thought about Catherine. He wondered if she was watching the same images. He wondered if she remembered the trip they'd taken to Berlin in 1978. when they'd stood at Checkpoint Charlie and stared across the divide at the gray buildings and blank-faced guards. He'd held her hand and said, "This won't last forever." And she'd said, "How do you know?" And he'd said, "Because lies never do." He'd been right. But the price of being right had been everything. Catherine died on March 3, 1989, 8 months before the wall fell. The cancer had been growing for 2 years. She'd ignored it at first, then treated it minimally, then simply accepted it. She died at Georgetown University Hospital with a colleague from the English department holding her hand. She was 52 years old. Her will left everything to her younger sister in Connecticut. The house, the books, the furniture. The sister came to Washington to clear out the townhouse. She found the copy of Moby Dick on a shelf in the bedroom, wrapped carefully in cloth. She flipped through it, found the tape, listened to 30 seconds, and turned it off. She didn't understand what she was hearing. It sounded like a confession, but about what? And who was this man? James Brennan? She vaguely remembered Catherine being married once, years ago, but the details were fuzzy. Hadn't he left? Hadn't there been some kind of scandal? She put the book and the tape in a box marked donations and took it to a Goodwill store in Arlington. The book was priced at $1. A retired schoolteacher bought it 3 days later. She never opened it. It sat on a shelf in her basement for 2 years until her daughter found it. During a spring cleaning in 1991. The daughter, curious about the odd weight, opened it and found the tape. She listened to it, didn't understand it, and thought it might be historically interesting. She donated it to the Library of Congress, along with several other boxes of her mother's old books and papers. The tape sat in an uncatalogued pile until June 1991, when a CIA archivist named Ellen Marsh was doing a routine review of materials that had been flagged for potential classification issues. She found the tape, played it, and immediately recognized what it was. She wrote a memo to her supervisor. The supervisor wrote a memo to his supervisor. Eventually, the tape made its way to a deputy director who'd been with the agency since the 1970s. He listened to it once, then checked the files. James Brennan. Cultural Attach, Moscow, 1979 to 1984. Suspected of unauthorized intelligence sharing, interrogated in 1985. Disposition, relocated under alias. Status, inactive. The deputy director sat in his office and thought about what to do. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union would officially dissolve in 6 months. The files were being declassified. The old secrets were becoming history. But this one wasn't history. It was a living man somewhere in Europe, still under an assumed name, still technically under agency control. And it was a dead woman who'd spent years looking for him, who'd tried to tell his story and been silenced. The deputy director made a decision. He sealed the tape in a file, marked it terminated no action, and sent it to deep storage. Then he wrote a brief note in the margin of James Brennan's personnel file. Subject deceased, natural causes, Brussels, 1987. No further action required. It was a lie. But it was also a kindness. It meant James Brennan was officially dead. Which meant Robert Miller could finally disappear too. Except James was still alive. He would remain alive for another 8 years. After the wall fell, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the world he'd known ceased to exist, James continued his small, invisible life in Brussels. He translated documents. He walked the streets. He aged. His hair went white. His hands developed tremors. He stopped drinking because it made the nightmares worse. He never learned that Catherine had died. He never learned that she'd tried to tell his story. He never learned that the tape existed, or that it had been found, or that someone at the CIA had officially declared him dead. He lived in the space between names, between identities, between truths. He was no one. He had been no one for so long that he'd forgotten how to be someone. In 1997, on a cold morning in February, James Brennan, still living as Robert Miller, suffered a heart attack while walking to the bakery near his apartment. A neighbor found him collapsed on the sidewalk. An ambulance came. He was taken to a hospital, where he died 3 hours later without regaining consciousness. There was no next of kin. No emergency contact. The Belgian authorities searched his apartment and found nothing. No photographs, no letters, no evidence of a life before Brussels. Just technical manuals, a few books, and a nearly empty refrigerator. He was cremated. His ashes were scattered in a communal garden outside the city. There was no funeral. No one came. Robert Miller was gone. And James Brennan, who had officially died 10 years earlier, was gone again. The only thing that remained was the tape, sealed in a file in a warehouse in Maryland. A voice in the dark, explaining crimes that no longer mattered. Confessing to a woman who would never hear it. Trying to justify choices that couldn't be justified. The tape would stay there for another decade. In 2001, as part of a post-Cold War declassification project, a junior researcher named Michael Kwan found it while cataloging old counterintelligence files. He listened to it, fascinated and horrified. He wrote a brief report recommending it be preserved as part of the historical record. His supervisor disagreed. The tape, she argued, contained information that could still harm living people, former assets, former officers, operational details that were technically still classified. And besides, what was the point? The people involved were dead. The war was over. Let the dead stay dead. The tape went back into storage. Sealed. Forgotten. But history doesn't forget. It just waits. In 2018, a graduate student researching Cold War espionage cases filed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to CIA operations in Moscow during the early 1980s. The request was broad and generic. Most of it was denied. But one file marked terminated. No action was partially released. The names were redacted. The locations were redacted. But the tape was included. The student listened to it and recognized its value. He wrote his dissertation on the moral ambiguity of Cold War intelligence work, using the tape as a central source. He gave the anonymous man on the recording a pseudonym, Agent X. The dissertation was published by a university press in 2020. It received modest attention, a few reviews in academic journals, a brief mention in a podcast about espionage history. The tape, or rather the transcript of the tape, was quoted extensively. Scholars debated whether Agent X was a traitor or a hero. Some said he'd betrayed his country. Others said he'd tried to prevent a nuclear war. No one could agree. But everyone agreed on one thing. He'd been destroyed by a system that couldn't tolerate ambiguity. A system that demanded absolute loyalty and punished anything less with absolute erasure. The dissertation never named James Brennan or Catherine. The real identities remained classified. The people were dead. The story was history. But the questions remained. What do you do when duty and conscience conflict? What do you do when your country asks you to become something you can't live with? What do you do when the war you're fighting stops making sense, but you're too deep to walk away? James Brennan tried to answer those questions. He made choices. He crossed lines. He lied to everyone, including himself. And in the end, he lost everything: his name, his wife, his country, his life. Was he a traitor? Technically, yes. He passed classified information to a foreign power. That's the definition. Was he a hero? No. Heroes don't hide. Heroes don't lie. Heroes don't let good people die to save themselves. Was he human? Yes. Painfully, completely, tragically human. And that's what makes his story unbearable. Because if James Brennan was a monster, we could dismiss him. If he was a saint, we could lionize him. But he was neither. He was a man who tried to do the right thing and discovered too late that there was no right thing, only choices and consequences. The Cold War was full of people like James, people who believed they were serving a greater good, people who made compromises in the name of security or peace or survival, people who woke up one day and realized they'd become strangers to themselves. The war ended. The wall fell. The archives opened. And we learned that most of the secrets weren't worth keeping. Most of the lies weren't worth telling. Most of the sacrifices weren't necessary. But the people who made them are still gone. And the lives they destroyed are still destroyed. Catherine Brennan died believing her husband had left her. She died without knowing he'd been taken. She died without hearing his voice on the tape, saying, "I'm sorry." James Brennan died alone in a foreign city under a false name. He died without knowing his wife had looked for him. He died without knowing she'd tried to tell his story. They never saw each other again. They never spoke again. They never had the chance to say goodbye or to forgive or to rage at each other for the impossible situation they'd been placed in. The system took that from them, not because they were threats, but because they were inconvenient. Because the truth of what had happened, that a good man had been asked to do something impossible and had broken under the weight of it, was too messy for the official narrative. So they erased him. And when she tried to bring him back, they erased her too, not physically, but socially, professionally. They made sure no one would listen, no one would care, and it worked. For decades, it worked. Until a tape surfaced and a story leaked. And someone finally asked, "What happened to James Brennan?" The answer is, everything and nothing. He lived. He died. He betrayed. He served. He loved. He lost. And in the end, he became a ghost. A name in a file. A voice on a tape. A question without an answer. But maybe that's the only honest way to remember the Cold War. Not as a story of heroes and villains, but as a story of ghosts. People who were asked to give up their humanity for an abstraction called national security. People who were told their sacrifices mattered, that history would remember them, that they were serving something greater than themselves. And then, history moved on. And they were forgotten, except for the tape. The one piece of evidence that James Brennan existed, that he tried, that he failed, that he was sorry. If you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, then maybe his story isn't over yet. Maybe there's still a chance for the truth to matter. Not for justice. It's too late for that. But for memory, for the recognition that these weren't just names in files. They were people, and they deserved better than what they got. The Cold War is over. But the ghosts remain, and they're still asking, was it worth it? We owe them an answer, even if the answer is no. If stories like this make you question what we really sacrificed in the name of security, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War ghosts whose stories deserve to be heard. Not because they were heroes, but because they were human. And that should be enough.